Okay, we have the
Yeah.
Assistant Dean of the Law School, Thomas Schoenherr. He is actually the Assistant Dean of Public Interest, which is a big interest of mine. It's something I actually taught last semester. So I just want to have you explain what that means to you and how you got into this field and how this can help tribes.
Sure. I'd like to extend my welcome to everyone who's there to Fordham. I'm sorry I can't join you. I'm actually out of town. I think you're in our moot courtroom, if I'm judging correctly from the video feed that I see. So I've been working at Fordham Law School for almost 30 years. When I started at the law school in 1988, we did not have a public interest resource center. I worked in the Career Planning Center, assisting students interested in both public and private sector legal careers to find jobs. And then our dean at the time, in my first year or two, became very interested in supporting law students who had been doing a variety of community service projects and pro bono work on their own. I got involved in those planning meetings, and long story short, in 1992, we opened what we call our Public Interest Resource Center, which I will call PIRC from now on, just to save time. And what we do primarily is my staff and I have a staff of me and 3 full-time support people. We support student-initiated pro bono and community service projects. And over the past 25 years, our roster of organizations that are student-initiated has grown from 3 when we started in the early 1990s. Now we support 27 student initiatives for a wide variety of community service work. I was looking at the areas. They include immigration, youth and children work, domestic violence advocacy, unemployment, anti-trafficking work on consumer law issues, health law, voting rights, housing rights, refugee rights, unemployment and labor law issues, and the rights of people who are incarcerated, just to give you a flavor of what our students are involved in. And in addition to supporting these student-based initiatives, and we have new ones that begin every year, my staff and I also counsel students who are interested in pursuing public sector work, public sector legal work on a full-time basis once they graduate. So I hope that gives a good overview, a good flavor of what I do at the law school.
All right, so we have members of the Ramapo tribe here that have a public interest issue. And I'd like to take the opportunity to have them describe it to you, and maybe you hear them out and see how they can proceed, maybe to get some help.
Yeah.
My name is Asst Smith. I'm known to Gare as Al, and we're involved in some very heavy-duty legal issues in our community. But before I talk about that, I wanted to just give the microphone to my chief, Dwayne Perry, to explain what's going on.
Well, that was lovely. I think maybe be more direct and a bit terse. Exactly what's coming on is pre-Dr. King redlining of zoning manipulation. We've gone from a 14 acres that was mined into being now the mantra of the township as a wetland. They created it. For the last 20, 25 years, we've been using it for ceremonial purposes. Since October, we've been under daily onslaught of zoning violations in the October last year. Onslaught of various zoning violations that are now totaling, for instance, TPs are permanent structures, that's worth $1,000 a week. An additional 2 foot of the overhang on the cook shed, that's worth $1,000 a week, or somewhere around $48,000. It's a very old manipulation of zoning, whereby technically when it's done, then you can't pay the fine and then put your property on auction. The land was returned to my people in the early 90s. It originally was owned by one of the tribal families that left Rockland County and sold their very successful farm for $1 and moved north. So right now we're under the gun by a fairly affluent community that seems to have undue influence with the local political base.
Yeah. I have to divulge from the outset, I'm not an expert in the law as it applies to especially Indigenous First Nations, which I over the years followed different issues, the issues that you're talking about right now in terms of land use. I remember it could have been a decade or two ago, similar issues with members of, I think, the Onondaga Nation in central New York. It's very complicated. As I was thinking about law as it pertains to First Nations, it's really, in many ways, international human rights law, because of course, you're a sovereign nation. And so laws that apply to you are, at least in theory, governed by treaties with the United States, but then it filters down to the state and local level as well, especially with these land issue disputes. I don't know if you've attempted to reach out in any way to local legal services providers close to you, either in New York or New Jersey. Has that been something that you've tried to explore?
We've been working with, and sometimes I think the local attorneys are oftentimes overlooked, so we have a local person on our team, but we also have the Eastern Environmental Law Center.
Yeah.
As well as the National Lawyers Guild.
Okay.
The problem is that, and I think even the center might have one time been a law clinic, but they have certain revenue needs as well.
Right.
What I see as a potential model is, say, at Standing Rock. The University of Colorado Law School was heavily involved in the litigation there in support of other ways. There was a law clinic, I believe, that was at the forefront of that.
Yeah.
Also had a group called Earth Justice.
Yeah.
That was spearheading that. So I think part of our frustration is that we need some of these types of organizations to be part of our circle. And our history is quite interesting in that the first case, national case of desegregation wasn't Brown versus Board of Education. It was the book school in Millburn, New York, one of our communities. And one of our members was one of the employees or officers at NAACP who was working with the Thurgood Marshall. So there's quite a bit of history in that region. And really, to be quite honest with you, you have to really look at the South to see similar types of social dynamics to what you have in Mawa. I mean, there's time and time again, I've heard people say how our children have been forced out of school at an early age. So this is why I'm glad that you're having this program, and every speaker has had very relevant things to say. So that's kind of where we're at now. I mean, does Fordham have a lot of law clinics, or how do they operate? Because I have to say that from what I heard about Tulane, the environmental law clinic there, I was quite impressed where the students there were so effective that the government wanted to shut them down because.
Yeah, exactly, right. Yeah, we do have at Fordham either 18 or 19 different law clinics currently. At this time, we don't have an environmental law clinic or a land use clinic. I know, well, the speaker directly following me is, it sounds like he's a consultant on environmental and natural resources issues based in DC. He might be a possible resource, but I'm glad you've connected with, I think you said, a clinic at the University of Colorado or University of Denver. And I do know that the University of Vermont Law School has a particular national specialty in environmental law and environmental issues. But just on first description, I'm not sure how much of the issue that you're describing is environmental law or land use law. It could very well involve both. And there are clinics. Our clinics at Fordham, for instance, will take cases and have teams of students under the supervision of a professor who is a licensed attorney working on these cases. Oftentimes the pipeline for these cases is 6 to 12 months in advance of any academic year, because the professors are very particular about the cases that they select. They want the cases to be educational for the students that they're teaching. So it's certainly an option to explore working in conjunction with a law school clinic. But it might, I'm not sure, it might be a limited option. That's why I was asking more about connections to legal services providers in the community. And I'm glad to hear that you've connected with the National Lawyers Guild. We have a very active student chapter at the law school affiliated with the National Lawyers Guild. The New York City chapter has a variety of different committees. They have members who are individuals and small law firms that do provide direct assistance to what's called plaintiff side redress seekers, people like you who have issues and you know they're looking for legal assistance to find remedies. As you know, these issues are often long-standing and take a long time to resolve. That's kind of how the law operates. I'm trying to think of any other potential tips to give you for local.
We have one question.
Yeah.
Thank you. I think there is one caveat that, number one, we don't have federal standing, although we have been recognized 500 plus federally recognized tribes and have
Okay.
resolution to that. Also, I think we've gone afield a bit in that this is very clearly a civil rights case.
Right.
There's very strong and ongoing history, a pattern of civil rights abuses.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, our relatives in the Hasidic community have gotten the Attorney General of New Jersey to bring charges or what have you against Mobile, New Jersey. The difference is we haven't taken any systemic steps nor had the capacity to confront this racism as what it is. It's not complicated. It's raw racism in your face and it's easily provable. So if there's somebody that understands human rights to that capacity, I'd love to speak to them. Well,
I mean, I'm glad you shared the issues regarding your status. Without federal recognition, as you know, it limits your abilities to seek legal remedies. But
I just want to ask, you said that it relates to international law, perhaps, in some ways. Can you just give a hint of how that works?
Well, first I'd like to say that another resource that we have at Fordham Law School is a very long-standing, large international human rights center, the Leitner Center for International Human Rights. And I think any student who would come to Fordham, I would strongly recommend, and I would assist them in reaching out to the professors and the administrators who run that center to collaborate on any issues that they were interested in exploring related to legal issues for First Nations. Because, well, I was assuming that your nation is federally recognized by the United States.
They're state recognized in the state of New Jersey.
I'm sorry?
We are state recognized in New Jersey.
Okay, then perhaps that provides some avenues for redress through the, I don't know, through the state attorney general's office, maybe. which I would assume has a civil rights bureau. I'm more familiar with the setup of the Attorney General's office in New York State. Is that something that you've explored at all?
Well, again, this is, I think, why Chief Perry wants to expand the circle. And just our discussion here is giving us avenues to pursue. But he had brought up the fact that Jewish people in a situation where, I believe they called it a rood, there was a ceremonial structure that was put in the town of Malwa to allow people to use certain items during the Sabbath. And the town was so extreme that even the local prosecutor told the police officer, the chief of police, do not enforce that ordinance. So they apparently have not only, as plaintiffs, filed a lawsuit, but they also petitioned the Attorney General of New Jersey, who apparently is going forward. Our situation is a little bit more complicated. Again, with us, you have more of an Alabama situation where the outgoing governor, who's larger than life in many ways, literally has said that New Jersey does not recognize any state tribes, which is untrue, because we do have recognition by resolution, and also there is a New Jersey Indian Commission. The outgoing governor said incredibly to the federal government, there are no tribes. And then a lot of our children, even three state recognized tribes, a lot of people lost money. And I remember even a case where there was a child who wanted to go to St. Mary's, and they were told, look, we can't help you out because you're not recognized.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I wish I could give you more direct advice and information about your particular case, but it's not being any sort of personal expert in this area. It's really hard to tell you how to proceed. I think persistence will be a very important factor for you.
I think this discussion is helpful in that. I mean, just talking about the New Jersey Attorney General's office and discuss, or even you say there might be people, even if you don't have a land use clinic, you have an international human rights clinic. And,
right.
I mean, it's interesting some of the ways our stories or narratives are weaving, like Two Hawks, Raymond. He and his group are similar to us in that relations started in the pre-contact, or not, well, they're pre-contact people, but before there was the United States. So sometimes the treaties and other matters are not, well, they might be more relevant to the Western nations, they're not as well relevant to the Eastern nations. But certainly for us, it's not just an interesting issue, it's an issue of survival, but certainly for academics, I can see a lot of interesting issues with, say, international human rights, for example.
Yeah, and actually, one thought I wanted to share with you, although I'm certainly promoting Fordham Law School, is the University of New Mexico Law School has a national reputation for their training for law students who are interested in particular in working with on international human rights issues with any of the indigenous nations that are, surrounded by the borders of the United States. They may be helpful as a resource. And years ago, another potential resource, you may have known about this or explored it already, but over the years, I've referred a few members of First Nations who've attended Fordham who were interested in exploring legal issues with their own nation to the American Indian Law Alliance. And I just this morning checked on their website. I'm not sure how active they are currently, but the founder, Tanya Ganella-Frischner, who sadly passed away 2 years ago, she was really a pioneer in advocating for recognition of Indigenous First Nation rights on a global level. And she was instrumental in the formation of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues that's now part of the United Nations. She would attend an annual conference in Geneva to promote issues related to Indigenous nations. again, within the borders of the United States, but also Indigenous First Nations worldwide. And still, if you check out their website, you may be able to contact staff there who might provide additional resources for you, connections that I'm not able to or not aware of at the moment. And I hope that might be helpful. And getting back to Melissa's original question about international human rights, it becomes quite complicated. You know, as I said, First Nations are sovereign nations, and there are hundreds of them. I was very very interested when I first connected with Tanya back in the 1990s and her work with the American Indian Law Alliance to learn that New York City is maybe the largest concentration of Indigenous peoples in the United States. Over 27,000 members of 70+ First Nations live in New York City, at least at that time, a decade or two ago. And another more social services organization, the American Indian Community House, which I also checked their website, and it seems like sadly they have encountered major issues with funding in the past year, but they still list a contact. And I was going to put out that, well, I'm not sure if you in the moot courtroom at Fordham already live in New York, but if there are participants in this webinar from outside of New York City, I was going to say that I think one of the huge advantages of New York is the diversity. And on the same, in the same breath, I would say that it's one of the challenges of such a huge urban area is if you are a member of a minority community, how do you connect with, how do you network to find support as a member of an Indigenous First Nation? And the American Indian Community House over the years has been one of those resources, but I'm not sure how much they are at the current time. I also wanted to say that for members of First Nations who attend law school, on the when they graduate and go to work, my experience has been that people explore a wide range of career choices when they graduate. And I never assume that a member of any minority community who comes to Fordham Law School will, when they graduate, go back to their community and work in their community. Some people pursue careers in the private sector, and already in this webinar, you've heard information about financial services, science and engineering, social entrepreneurship, and organizational issues in business. And certainly legal skills can be applied in any of those settings, and soon you'll hear about natural resources and environmental law and healthcare. And legal skills are applicable in any of these areas. And I wanted to dispel a myth. I think a lot of people thinking of pursuing legal education feel that they have to first get a degree in a particular discipline in undergraduate school before they can apply to law school. And I think most people think that they have to study political science or government or something related to that in order to qualify to apply to law school. And that is certainly not the case. We have students who have backgrounds in math and science and anthropology and sociology and theater and any undergraduate discipline you can imagine, who apply to law school and then go on to careers in the law using their legal skills in a very broad range of settings. And another thing in my decades of work in counseling students and alumni who are working in the public sector in law, some people do work providing direct services to members of the community that they came from, or or other communities that they develop an interest and a passion about while they're in law school. And other students find out that their interests are more related to policy, legislative advocacy, or other areas that don't require or involve so much direct service work. And especially alumni that I've worked with who have been working in the legal community for a very long time, some people switch back and forth. Some people will work for a nonprofit organization doing direct client service work, and after several years, they'll leave and they'll go to a government agency, either at the local, state, or federal level, or international level, and they'll work on policy issues, or vice versa. And likewise, some people will graduate and they'll spend a few years or several years working in the private sector at a law firm, oftentimes to earn money, to pay back loans that they take to go to law school. And then they'll transition to working in the government sector or the nonprofit sector. So another myth I wanted to dispel is that working in the legal marketplace, you have to find one path and stick to it for your career. That's very rare. More often than not, people will gain experience in one area and then transition and move into other areas as their career evolves.
Okay, so just for the issues that have come up today, is there a possibility that we can explore some pathways for getting answers, at the very least, with the law school?
Yeah, I would say if any of the members of the audience want to email me, Melissa, I'll assume that you could provide my email contact. Yeah, I was thinking as you were speaking about the issues, about contacting my colleagues who work at the International Human Rights Center, or professors at the law school who are working on land use issues, or I'm friends with the director of our law school clinic, who I knew actually when he was a student at Fordham Law School in the 1990s, and just to do some networking to see if either colleagues at Fordham Law School, or if they could give me information about colleagues of theirs at other law schools who might be.
Yeah, because this is a really fascinating issue for me, but I see it happening, and I've addressed it with other tribal people where it was just, I call it land encroachment.
Yeah.
And there's examples of what's been done with this land, but I dealt with it personally on using strategies on other cases. So it's a very common thing. In fact, when I was at 60 Minutes, I did something on the Gullah people and how the military was, you know, as they were retiring, the Navy, they saw the islands and said, you know what, we want those. And they did the same tactics, which this was many years ago, of raising taxes and what have you. And it really did reshape the whole area. So I do think it's a worthwhile issue for the law school to deal with. So we'll try to take some baby steps towards getting those things done. But I really appreciate your time.
Sure.
And your suggestions. It was very important to this group.
Good.
Thank you.
Happy to help. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, and have a great day.
You too.
Okay, just disconnect from the system there.
Okay.
All right. So now we have Mr. Jody A. Cummings, and he does environmental law. You guys are smiling. Do you know him? Okay, so can you hear us?
I can hear you guys fine. Can you hear me? Can you see me?
Yes, I can. Can you just lift, push the top of your, yes, that's
better.
Okay, that's a little better.
Don't want to get too close.
Light coming out of your head. I want you to know that. All right, so he is an environmental attorney for tribal areas, so he can kind of address some of what you discussed already with the public interest attorney, who is the dean here, assistant dean at the law school, who suggested that maybe it's land use, it's a land use issue, or it could also have to do environment, but we also explored civil rights and international rights because it's a tribal area. And so we're talking about the Ramapo Nation in New York, and how there's encroachment on their land, and it's been going on for many, many years. And I'd like to have Chief Perry please share what's going on briefly. Thank you.
Thank you. essentially what's going on is some of our land was returned a number of years ago, and it's been acknowledged by the county executive and other people that we use it for ceremonial rights. And back on October 16th, we've been encountering opposition on a daily basis in terms of zoning. For instance, one of the mantras is it's wetland, but it will